There is a stone spear point sitting in the British Museum in London right now. It is 8 inches long, weighs 4.4 pounds, and is 1.2 million years old. And according to the research we are diving into today, it was never once thrown as a spear, not even close. Today, we are completely reassessing Paleolithic culture, specifically what the actual predators and prey of that world looked like, how our ancestors hunted them without getting killed, and what a collection of etched stones found in Wales tells us about the very first information technology. By the end of this episode, you will never look at a museum display the same way again. I've got someone here who has gone deep into this research, and I want to start with a question that I think reframes everything. If our ancestors weren't throwing spears at mammoths, what on earth were they actually doing out there?
So the short answer is they were thinking a lot and planning and using psychology in ways that honestly should make us rethink the word primitive entirely.
Okay, I love that framing. But let's back up, because I think a lot of people's mental image of the Paleolithic is basically a naked person with a rock. Where does that image even come from, and why is it so wrong?
Right. So the research makes a really pointed argument here. The claim is that post-World War II museum displays were deliberately shaped to push back against the idea of racial superiority, which, understandable, right? But the overcorrection was to depict our ancestors as essentially naked apes, stripped of sophistication, stripped of clothing, stripped of cognitive complexity. And the research argues that is just as much a distortion of the truth as the myths it was trying to counter.
So the museum display becomes its own kind of propaganda.
Exactly. And the argument is that leather, bone, and woven plant fibers were all used throughout the Paleolithic. We've always had evidence of clothing. But the displays don't show that, because showing a clothed, tool-using, psychologically sophisticated hunter implies modern cognition, and that apparently makes people uncomfortable in ways that are more political than scientific.
Okay, so let's talk about what the world actually looked like. Because I think to understand the hunting strategies, you first have to understand what these people were up against. And from what I've read in this research, the predator list is genuinely terrifying.
It is. It really is. So let's start at the top. The apex predators of the Paleolithic were bears, and not the bears we think of today. Paleolithic bears stood 5 feet at the shoulder on all fours, that's already enormous, and 12 feet when standing on their hind legs. Mature males could weigh as much as 3,000 pounds.
Wait, 3,000 pounds?
3,000 pounds. And these were not solitary animals. They were social. They hunted in troops. They defended territory ferociously. The research points to Kodiak bears in Alaska as the closest modern reference point, and even those can almost reach the size of Paleolithic bears. So we're not talking about something mythological. We're talking about something that actually existed and that our ancestors had to navigate every single day.
And bears weren't the only thing out there.
Not even close. You also had cave lions, 5 feet at the shoulder, up to 900 pounds, capable of hitting 40 kilometers per hour in a burst. Saber-toothed cats that stood 4 feet at the shoulder and weighed up to 750 pounds. And then hyenas, which the research describes as the most frequent threat to early European kindred groups. 5 feet in length, up to 200 pounds each, hunting in packs of scores of animals.
Hyenas in Wales. That is not something I ever expected to say.
Right? Hyena bones have been found as far north and west as Wales. And the research makes this really vivid point. Hyenas would have learned early on that a group of humans meant an imminent kill, so they would follow hunting bands, waiting to swarm in and take the carcass. The research describes their troop behavior as, quote, psychopathic. It's commonplace even today for lions to be driven from their own kill by a troop of hyenas.
So you've got 3,000-pound bears, 900-pound lions, packs of hyenas, and then on top of all that, you've got the prey animals themselves, which were also enormous.
This is the part that really reframes everything. The prey species of the Paleolithic were megafauna, and that word gets thrown around, but let's actually sit with what it means. Woolly mammoths stood 13 feet at the shoulder and weighed as much as 13 tons. The research points out that 50% of body mass would be inedible, so one mammoth kill represented roughly 13,000 pounds of food and 13,000 pounds of usable byproduct. The hide of a single mammoth was enough to provide a seamless roof for a kindred lodge.
That is a windfall. That is a genuinely life-changing single event.
Exactly. And then you had woolly rhinos, nearly 7 feet at the shoulder, 13 feet in length, up to 7,000 pounds, capable of charges exceeding 20 kilometers per hour. Aurochs, the ancestors of all modern cattle, 6 feet at the shoulder, up to 3,300 pounds, with horns nearly 3 feet long. The research describes the aurochs as far more aggressive than any domestic breed of cattle.
So the average Paleolithic hunter, who the research says was rarely taller than 5 feet and rarely more than 125 pounds, is operating in a world where everything around them is trying to either eat them or trample them.
That's the exact framing the research uses, and it makes this really stark point. One-on-one, none of these predators would have been a fair fight. A dire wolf alone, 175 pounds, hunting in packs of 20 or more, would decisively win against a single human. So the question becomes, how did they survive? And the answer is not brute force, it's cognition.
Okay, so let's get into the actual mechanics of the hunt, because this is where the research gets genuinely fascinating. Start with the bear headdress, because that is one of the most counterintuitive things I've come across in a long time.
So the research introduces this figure, the leader of the kindred hunting group, and calls him Arthur, not as a specific historical person, but as a title. The argument is that in pre-Roman times, the leader of the kindred was called Athair in Gaelic, which is also the root of the word father. Arthur, Father, in Dutch and Deutsch, it's all the same concept. The patriarch, the one who leads the hunt.
So King Arthur is literally just the father figure, the hunt leader.
The research argues King Arthur is actually redundant as a title because Arthur already means king. But here's the key thing about Arthur. He wore a bear headdress. And this wasn't ceremonial. It was strategic. The research argues that psychology is operative in all sentient life forms at all times. Every animal that encounters an apex predator is automatically triggered, even other apex predators.
So if you look like a bear, everything that isn't a bear runs.
Everything that isn't a bear flees like its hair is on fire. That's the exact language the research uses. So Arthur, wearing a bear headdress, walking across the plains of Europe, clears the field of every lesser predator and every prey animal except the bears themselves, which means the hunting party only has to worry about one threat category. That is a massive tactical advantage.
And there's a second function too, right? Because the bear headdress also works on the prey animals you're actually trying to hunt.
Yes, and this is where it gets really elegant. The research draws a direct line to bullfighting. Arthur's role was to attract and maintain the undivided attention of the prey, specifically the alpha male of a herd, while the rest of the hunting party closed in from the flanks. He was baiting bulls away from the herd by wearing a bear headdress. And the research makes this wild observation. The traditional matador's headdress, even today, is designed to make a human look like a dangerous predator. The scale has diminished across the ages, but the origins of the design are there.
That is a connection I never would have made. Bullfighting as a living echo of Paleolithic hunting technique.
And the research also draws on Native American traditions to support this. Fathers taught their sons to evoke the spirit of the bear, the spirit of the eagle, the spirit of the buffalo on the hunt. Hunters who mastered the spirit of the wolf could drive a herd of bison into a trap with just a bloodthirsty chorus. These weren't superstitions, they were applied animal psychology.
Okay, so walk me through the actual mechanics of a hunt, because the research describes this in really specific detail. The stalking screens, the stumble pits, the whole coordinated operation.
So it starts with planning, and we'll get to the planning tools in a minute because that's its own incredible story. But the hunt itself, multiple teams of stalkers would construct stalking screens from thin branches woven with leafy greens. They'd approach the herd from downwind, advancing only when the animals were looking away, freezing the moment an alpha looked in their direction.
And the key is approaching in a direct line, not laterally.
Exactly. The research explains this beautifully. Movement of an object right or left stands out and causes alarm. But a bush getting closer in a direct line? Against the backdrop of the surrounding environment, it's too difficult to detect. So teams would advance until they were as close as they needed to be. And if one team got spotted, a team on the opposite flank would wave a distractor, a leafy branch, to draw the alpha's attention away.
So they're actively managing the animal's attention in real time.
In real time. And then when all teams are in position, Arthur and his best men, dressed in bear skins and bear headdresses, leap from behind their stalking screens and charge toward the herd, roaring. All teams simultaneously leap out, beating the ground and brush, screaming. The herd panics. The alphas stampede in the safest direction, which Arthur has already determined in advance, directly into stumble pits lined with stone-tipped pikes.
And that brings us back to that 4.4 pound stone point in the British Museum, because the research argues it was never a thrown spear, it was a pike tip planted in the ground.
Right. And the research makes this really kinesthetic argument about it. It says, go grab a book that weighs 4.4 pounds, hold it at arm's length at shoulder height. Now imagine that's just the stone tip. The wooden shaft it would need to be mounted on would weigh far more. Nobody was throwing that. Arthur had no intention of going toe-to-toe with any of the animals his kinsmen hunted. The pike was planted. The animal ran into it.
Which is a completely different mental image than what you see in museum murals.
Completely different. And the research is pretty direct about those murals. It calls them jingoistic propaganda, not based on archaeological evidence, but on the narrative of social evolution. The idea that everyone prior to ancient Egypt was a primitive, ignorant barbarian. The research argues that framing has done real damage, including to Native American communities whose sophisticated cultures get filtered through that same lens.
Okay, so now I want to get into what I think is the most mind-bending part of all this, the hunt tokens. Because this is where the research makes its boldest claim about cognition and information technology.
So on display in the National Museum of Wales in Cardiff, there is a collection of hunt tokens, radiocarbon dated to 24,000 BC. And that date is significant because 24,500 BC is the accepted date of the glacial maximum, the point at which a continental ice sheet measuring 3 kilometers thick covered nearly all of northern Europe.
So these tokens were made right at the edge of the ice, in one of the harshest environments humans have ever lived in.
Right at the edge. And what are they? They're etched stones. Some have diagrams of pitfall traps covered in screens of leaves and brambles. Some show deadfalls, large scaffolds of logs with stone-tipped pikes affixed. Some show lean-to traps. There are also etched teeth found in the same region. The research argues these are, for all intents and purposes, information technology, devices used to diagram and coordinate planned activity.
So Arthur was literally sandboxing the hunt beforehand, running through scenarios with physical tokens before committing his people to the field.
That's exactly the language the research uses, sandboxing. Each token represents a team or an asset, a pitfall and deadfall, a lean-to, a stalking screen team. You lay them out, you work through the plan, you identify the problems before anyone's life is on the line. And the research calls this iconographic language, compositions that feature indexes of implements of the Great Hunt. That is writing, functional, purposeful, symbolic writing.
And the research pushes this even further back, right? There's a claim about cartography that goes way earlier than 24,000 BC.
This is the really paradigm-shifting claim. The research argues that cartographical method was being employed by hominins in Africa as early as 414,000 BC. And the argument is that cartography requires trigonometry, not necessarily called that, but the underlying spatial reasoning is the same. If that's true, it pushes the evidence for modern cognition back by hundreds of thousands of years.
That would completely rewrite the timeline of human intelligence.
It would. And the research uses the Soningen spears, meticulously crafted javelins found in Germany, dated to 300,000 BC, as a previous benchmark for advanced cognition. The argument is that if the cartography claim holds, we don't even need the spears anymore. The maps get us there first.
There's also this really interesting observation in the research about the size of stone tools over time. Can you walk through that? Because it's one of those things that seems obvious once you hear it, but nobody apparently said it before.
So the research points out that the earliest stone tools are larger and the more recent tools are smaller. And the explanation offered is almost frustratingly logical. The implements of the Great Hunt become smaller over the course of history because the size of the prey being hunted decreases over time. As megafauna populations declined, you needed smaller tools for smaller animals. The tool record is literally a graph of ecological change.
And nobody in mainstream archaeology apparently connected those dots.
The research is pretty pointed about that. It says if modern human cognition were in evidence in the humanities department, my colleagues would have figured out why. It's a bit of a burn, but the logic is hard to argue with.
Let's talk about what happened after a successful hunt, because the research describes this whole logistical operation around defending and preserving a kill that I found really compelling.
So after a mammoth goes down, the danger is not over. The herd has moved on, but blood in the air draws every predator in the region. Paleolithic bears, hyena troops, dire wolf packs, they're all closing in. So while one team begins butchering the carcass and wrapping the choicest cuts in hide bundles, Arthur and his best men are holding the perimeter.
And they can't carry everything back at once.
Not even close. So what they do is bury the surplus in field caches, the same stumble pits used in the hunt. Hide bundles go in, rocks get piled on top, then loose earth covers the rocks to seal it from the air. And then a small team stays behind to guard the cache, lights a fire on top of the mound, and holds position until Arthur returns with the rest of the kindred group.
And the research connects this directly to mound architecture found throughout Europe, Asia, and the Americas.
There is science, not coincidence, behind these early designs. That's the direct quote. The hunter cache leads inextricably to mound architecture. And the research makes this lovely observation that this archaic method of food storage was still in use until the invention of refrigeration. The practice of storing fermented vegetables underground in Korea, that's a living thread connecting back to the Paleolithic.
I want to zoom out for a second because there's a word the research uses to describe Paleolithic civilization that I think is genuinely perfect. Glamping.
Glamping. And it's not meant dismissively, it's actually a really precise description. Our ancestors didn't have the technologies we have today, but the research argues they didn't need them. They had everything they needed for the life they were living. They followed the migrating herds, they set up camp, they had sophisticated food preservation, coordinated hunting strategies, information technology, psychological tools. From 3.2 million years ago until 24,500 BC, mankind was glamping.
And the herds themselves were the economy. Everything came from the herds.
Everything. Food, raw materials, shelter. The research describes kindred groups following the seasonal migrations north to south, winter camps in the south near the Mediterranean, summer camps in the plains of northern Europe. And all along those migration routes, they were crossing the territories of bears who were already on the hunt, which is why the bear headdress wasn't just useful on the hunt, it was essential for the journey itself.
There's also this really interesting point about subordinate male bears in the fall, because that's when the danger spiked.
Right. So in a good breeding year for bears, alpha males drive subordinate males out of the territory. Come fall, when pressure increases to put fat on for winter, these subordinate males wander outside their troops' range to secure territory of their own. They're aggressive, acting outside of their troop structure, and the research describes them as very much fight over flight. They'd stalk the herds, and they were not at all opposed to eating a stray human.
So the most dangerous moment of the year was the fall migration south, when you're moving through unfamiliar bear territory with hungry subordinate males actively looking for a fight.
And the research puts it starkly, either Arthur got the bear, or a bear got one of Arthur's kinsmen. There was no neutral outcome. That's the world these people navigated every single day, and they did it with intelligence, planning, and psychology rather than brute force.
I want to push back on one thing, or at least raise the counter-argument, because some people will hear all of this and say, okay, but isn't this just one researcher's interpretation? How do we know the hunt tokens are actually planning devices and not something else entirely?
That's a fair challenge, and the research acknowledges it's running against academic consensus. The argument isn't that we have a signed confession from Arthur explaining what the tokens were for. The argument is that the iconographic content, the diagrams of pitfall traps, deadfalls, lean-to structures, is specific enough that the planning interpretation is the most parsimonious one. These aren't abstract marks. They're functional diagrams of hunting infrastructure.
And the context matters too. They're found in the same region, at the same date, alongside the other material evidence of sophisticated hunting.
Exactly. And the research makes a broader point that I think is worth sitting with. Accredited academia has never really had to use the tools they found in the manner they were imagined to have been used. Nobody in the ivory tower ever tried to throw a 4.4-pound stone point at a mammoth. If they had, they might have arrived at the pike interpretation a lot sooner.
There's also this fascinating claim about the word Aryan that I think deserves a moment, because it connects to the broader argument about how language gets distorted.
So the research argues that Aryan is Sanskrit and has only ever meant one thing: civilized. It's an adjective, not a noun. And the research makes this pointed observation: you can't be descended from an adjective. You can be descended from a noun, but not an adjective. The National Socialists misread it as a racial category, which is a fundamental linguistic error. And the research argues that Arthur and his people were Aryan in the original sense. They were civilized. They just seem brutish to us because they lived in a brutal world.
Civilized people operating in an uncivilized environment. That reframe is doing a lot of work.
It really is. And it connects to the research's core argument about cognitive capacity. The research points out that chimpanzees, thought to be our closest primate cousins, have been shown in experiments to possess language and reasoning skills, and can recognize, interpret, and use symbology. They've been taught limited sign language, and yet we're still required to accept that human intelligence was a very recent evolutionary adaptation. The research finds that contradiction untenable.
So the argument is, if our closest primate relatives were already cognitively sophisticated, why would we assume the human line was cognitively primitive for millions of years?
That's the core of it. And the research uses the Soningen spears, found in Germany, dated to 300,000 BC, as one data point. Meticulously crafted javelins that prove intelligence in design. But the cartography claim, if it holds, pushes that evidence back to 414,000 BC. The research argues that cartographical method is irrefutable proof of modern cognition, because the techniques and technologies required to make maps are tantamount to performing trigonometry.
And the research also makes this interesting observation about the glacial maximum itself, that it actually disproves certain historical myths about who lived where.
Right. Between 125,000 BC and 24,500 BC, nearly all of northern Europe was under 3 kilometers of glacial ice. The research uses this to make a very direct point. Nobody lived in northern Europe during that period. Not in modern times, not in Roman times, not at any time during the glacial maximum, which means certain nationalist myths about ancient northern European civilizations are geologically impossible.
The ice sheet is the fact checker.
The ice sheet is the fact checker. And the research also notes that the term Germania itself derives from maps drawn by Caesar in the last 2 centuries BC. In Latin, German implied common ancestry, essentially Caesar's observation that people living north of the Rhine all looked alike. It was a geographic label, not an ethnic identity. The research calls it a racist label in modern terms.
Okay, so when you step back from everything we've covered today, the predators, the prey, the hunting strategies, the tokens, the cartography, what's the through line? What's the thing that ties all of it together?
The through line is cognition. The research's central argument is that modern human intelligence is not a recent development. It was present and operative throughout the Paleolithic. And the evidence for that isn't abstract. It's in the bear headdresses, which required understanding animal psychology. It's in the stalking screens, which required understanding prey behavior. It's in the stumble pits and pike arrays, which required engineering and planning. And it's in the hunt tokens, which are literally the first information technology.
And the size of the tools tells the story of the ecology changing around them.
The tools shrink as the prey shrinks. The atlatl gets invented when the megafauna start to fail. Then the bow and arrow. The technology evolves in direct response to ecological change. These are not the adaptations of a primitive mind. These are the adaptations of a sophisticated mind responding to a changing world.
Here's what this really comes down to, I think. We've been handed a story about our ancestors that was shaped more by 20th century politics than by the archaeological evidence. And what this research is doing, whatever you think of every individual claim, is demanding that we look at the evidence on its own terms.
And the stakes of getting it wrong are real. The research makes this point about Native American children being conditioned by curricula that frames their ancestors as less socially evolved. That's not a victimless academic debate. The story we tell about the past shapes how people see themselves in the present.
The inverse of a lie is not the truth. That's a line from the research that I keep coming back to. You can't correct a distortion by replacing it with the opposite distortion.
That's the most important methodological point in the whole thing. The post-war overcorrection produced its own mythology, and the research is arguing for something harder. Just follow the evidence, even when it leads somewhere uncomfortable. Even when it implies that people who lived 300,000 years ago were smarter than we've been giving them credit for.
Which, when you think about it, should not be a controversial conclusion. These were people who survived in a world with 3,000-pound bears, 900-pound lions, and herds of 13-ton mammoths. Stupidity was not a viable survival strategy.
The Great Hunt was not won by the strongest, it was won by the smartest. And the evidence, the tokens, the headdresses, the stumble pits, the stalking screens, all of it points to people who were thinking several moves ahead. Arthur didn't survive by being brave. Arthur survived by being right.
So here's what I want you to take away from today. Next time you walk through a museum of natural history and see a mural of naked figures waving spears at a mammoth, you now have the tools to ask the right questions. Who planned this hunt? What were they wearing? What did they know about the psychology of the animals they were hunting? And what were those etched stones in their pockets actually for?
And remember that 4.4-pound stone point in the British Museum. It was never thrown, it was planted. Because Arthur was not stupid enough to throw a rock at a mammoth, he was smart enough to make the mammoth run into it.
That is the perfect note to end on.